Okay, so welcome everyone to the YouTube channel of Talmud for Everyone. This is a new segment that I'm launching called Two Scholars and a Talmud, inspired by the company Two Guys and a Truck. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Weiss to this new program. Dr. Daniel Weiss is a senior lecturer in Jewish studies at the Faculty of Divinity of the University of Cambridge. He holds a Master's of Theology from Harvard Divinity School and a PhD from the University of Virginia's Department of Religious Studies. Weiss is the author of Modern Jewish Philosophy and the Politics of Divine Violence, published by Cambridge in 2023, as well as Paradox and the Prophets, Herman Cohen and the Indirect Communication of Religion, which came out in 2012 with Oxford. He's also co-edited several volumes, including Tzimtzum and Modernity, Lurianic Heritage in Modern Philosophy and Theology, published by De Gruyter in 2021. Scripture and Violence by Routledge in 2021 as well. Interpreting Interreligious Relations with Wittgenstein, with Brill in 2019, and Purity and Danger Now, New Perspectives with Routledge in 2016. Weiss is actively involved in the Cambridge Interfaith Program and is a recent recipient of the Humboldt Research Fellowship for Experienced Researchers. Daniel, welcome to our program. Thank you for your generosity and time to share with us your expertise about things related to the Talmud and rabbinics. We met a couple years ago at ICSA for a panel by our good colleague Holger Zeletin on his book Law Beyond Israel, and then recently at a fantastic conference in Lund organized by our colleague Karen Zetterholm. Before we start discussing your article, a recent article that we're going to focus on here for this segment called Iconic Theology in Classical Rabbinic Literature and Orthodox Christianity, which came out in 2023 in the volume Elone Mamre, The Encounter of Judaism and Orthodox Christianity. Could you tell the viewers a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in the study of rabbinics?
Sure, great. And thank you for having me here. My interest in rabbinics goes back in my scholarship and my studies before, during my PhD as well. I've sort of had two streams of research throughout my career. So on the one hand, there's been a focus on modern Jewish philosophical thought, and that's like I said, looking at the modern period. But alongside that, I've had a focus on classical Jewish texts, so both biblical and rabbinic literature, and then often trying to look at the intersection between the modern thinkers and then the classical Jewish text, but also looking at each of those streams separately. And in addition, throughout a lot of it, I've had a interest and recurrent focus on looking at interreligious relations, and so particularly Jewish and Christian relations. So it's a lot of that. So all of those streams have come in throughout my career, and so this particular article draws especially on the interest in rabbinics and on then the Jewish and Christian relations.
Okay, so it's very interesting. You have a broad set of interests then and now, but also rabbinics in dialogue with other religious traditions. In this case, what caught my attention is that the volume in which your article appears deals with the dialogue between Judaism and Orthodox Christianity. Many of our viewers, Jewish, Christian as well, if I'm thinking of those at least here in the US, might not be familiar with the Orthodox Christian stream. Could you tell us a little bit about what is Orthodox Christianity?
Yes, sure. So this is Orthodox Christianity. Sometimes you might also hear this referred to Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And essentially, in short, it's you could say it's another branch or stream of Christian tradition. People may have, in the US, for instance, may be more familiar with Protestantism and Catholicism. So we can basically think of Orthodox Christianity as then a third branch alongside that. And it's, for instance, it's the majority Christian group in many countries, such as Greece, Ukraine, Romania, Russia. So it's a prominent branch of Christianity in that way, and also has congregations in other countries, including the US, where you are, in the UK. So you might encounter a Greek Orthodox church in your local area, for instance. And this particular volume that this article stems from is itself originates from a dialogue group, an interreligious dialogue group, specifically with Jews and Orthodox Christians, which was a group this dialogue group has been based in the UK and has met regularly since 1997. And so it was after a series of these years of dialogues that then the group had the idea to put together an edited volume looking at aspects of relation between Judaism and Orthodox Christianity, so that more people would have a chance to read about some of these reflections on similarities and differences between those two groups.
Which is a fairly, I think, unique and great contribution, I think, because at least in the West here, I'm thinking as somebody who is interested in dialogue between different religious traditions as well, there's been a lot of work done in Jewish Roman Catholic relations, Jewish Protestant relations, but not so much in the area of Jewish Orthodox dialogue. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes, no, I think that was actually one of the reasons for wanting to put the volume together. I think especially in, say, Western Europe and North America, more of the, especially the Jewish Christian dialogue has more so been with Protestant or Roman Catholic. Part of that could be because those are the majority groups in the, say, English speaking or French speaking or German speaking contexts, where a lot of the Jewish Christian dialogue has taken place.
Right.
So that could be part of the reason. But right, so we're looking to fill that gap because there are various ways in which looking at Jewish and Orthodox Christianity can give some new or different perspectives.
Okay, yeah, so this is going to be a great contribution. I mean, it's already out. And by the way, we're going to provide a link below this video with a description where you can access the volume or purchase it, hopefully. So moving to your article, you note that classical rabbinic texts of Judaism have a very iconic, I don't know if I should put scare quotes around that, but I want to talk about what that means, iconic understanding of the human being. Before you explain what you mean by iconic perspectives in classical rabbinic literature, for our viewers here, could you tell us what is classical rabbinic literature?
Right. So if we're talking about this term, which you would often encounter in scholarship, say classical rabbinic literature tends to refer to the texts of the broad rabbinic movement, but prior to the Middle Ages. So you might have classical rabbinic literature, then followed by medieval rabbinic literature, then modern rabbinic literature. So it's this early period, and people usually would include in the classical rabbinic literature category basically texts, Jewish texts stemming from around the compilation of the Mishnah in the beginning of the 3rd century, say up through the compilation of the Babylonian Talmud in around the 6th century. Again, it's not hard and fast boundaries, but around that time span. And actually these texts, when we talk about classical rabbinic literature, there are actually two distinct main rabbinic communities during this time period. There's the Palestinian rabbinic community and then the Babylonian rabbinic community. So the Palestinian community is based in there's a Roman Palestine, also known in the rabbinic texts themselves as the land of Israel. Mm-hmm. And then the Babylonian rabbinic community is what was then Babylon, parts of what is now Iraq. And most of the rabbinic texts that we have stem from the Palestinian rabbinic community. That's where they seem to have been formed. But one of the most prominent of the classical rabbinic texts, namely the Babylonian Talmud, stems from the Babylonian rabbinic community. So in terms of the number of different collections, the majority are from the Palestinian context. Mm-hmm. Although in terms of the one that was studied the most subsequently is from the Babylonian context in the Babylonian.
What people usually mean, I mean, or understand when they say Talmud today. Sorry for just interrupt, in Talmud, it's the Babylonian Talmud usually that they're referring to. I'm thinking of lay people, or in the Jewish community, if they say just Talmud, it's the Bavli,
Exactly.
right? Babylonian
Right. So
Talmud.
the Babylonian Talmud or Bavli. So there are two Talmuds. There's the Palestinian or the Jerusalem Talmud, the Yerushalmi, and then the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli. But yes, if you encounter someone talking about that they were studying Talmud the other day, and they don't specify whether it was the Palestinian or Babylonian, it would be the Babylonian. So often Talmud is shorthand for Babylonian Talmud in
This
practice.
is why I called this segment Two Scholars and a Talmud.
Right.
Which Talmud is it? It's usually the Babylonian Talmud. My impression is those who study the Yerushalmi or the Palestinian Talmud are mainly investigators, academics, and some rabbis. But in addition to the Palestinian Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, during this classical period, right, which runs about 6 centuries or so, the Mishnah contains teachings of sages from the first 2 centuries, roughly, of the Common Era. There are other rabbinic works from this period beyond the Talmud, right? What are some of them, just briefly?
Right. So just to give an example, so you have the Mishnah, as we said, the Talmud or Talmuds, and then, for instance, also there's collections of Midrash, which is a classical rabbinic scriptural interpretation. And so a famous collection there would be Genesis Rabbah or Bereshit Rabbah, which is a series of homiletic interpretations on passages, verses from the book of Genesis. And so then the Midrash Rabbah collection, you have also Genesis Rabbah, you have Exodus Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, Numbers Rabbah, Deuteronomy Rabbah, and etc. So those are Midrash collections organized by a certain focus on different books of the Bible. So that's another example.
Right. And yeah, because in your article, this is just for our viewers here, you cover diverse rabbinic works from the classical period. So some of them are these midrashic works,
Right.
Midrash Rabbah. We have also halachic midrashim sometimes, or they're called Tanaitic midrashim.
Yep.
But even midrashim on other works such as the Book of Psalms,
Right.
well, right. So all of this basically is lumped under the classical period. I once heard one of my professors in rabbinic said that in Judaism, the Middle Ages starts with the completion of the Babylonian Talmud. I don't know what you think about that, but that basically wraps up, right, the classical period. It's the completion of the Babylonian Talmud. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that's why I said sometimes people tend to date the classical period up through the completion of the Babylonian Talmud. And I think again there are various midrashic collections that were also compiled around that time. So some a little before, some slightly after the Babylonian Talmud. But that's a rough working usage to say it goes up through the Babylonian Talmud.
So there's a vast, what we're talking about here, literary corpus during this period. It's not just simply the Talmud. We have these other rabbinic works in parallel at this time.
Right. No, exactly. So the Babylonian Talmud itself takes up many volumes. Just as you can call that one work, but it's a huge work. We see some in the background there, and then right, even just beyond that, alongside there's various other of these substantial collections of rabbinic commentary and interpretation, narratives, etc., found in these other works.
Okay, great. So excellent. I'm just that's a nice segue because your article begins with an analysis of an interesting passage from Leviticus Rabbah. So this would be a midrash or a rabbinic commentary on the book of Leviticus. And the passage in question from this midrashic work opens with a quotation from actually the book of Proverbs, which states, quote, "The pious man," or we could say maybe person if we like, "does good to his own soul or self," nafsho, nephesh in Hebrew. Could you explain, because you do allude to this in your article, what a nephesh is according to the biblical and rabbinic understandings?
Right. So this is a key term, and the term nephesh is a Hebrew term. So in the Hebrew Bible, it appears multiple times. And if you see different English translations, sometimes you might see it as translated as self. Other times you might see it translated as soul. It could sometimes be translated even as, say, life or the person in that sense of the self. But I think a good example for getting at what the term seems to mean in the biblical context is if you look in the beginning, near the beginning of the book of Genesis, especially in chapter 2, it talks about God creating a human being from the dust of the ground, and then breathing into the human being the breath of life, nishmat chayim. And it said the combination of that breathing of the breath of life into the dust of the ground results in that the human being becomes a nephesh chaya, a living nephesh, a living being. So in a certain way, we could say that the nephesh is not simply the soul as something immaterial, but it's this dynamic living combination of the breath of life, God's breathing of the breath of the neshama with the material component. So it's not the spiritual in contrast to the material, but that dynamic combination of the living being is the nephesh.
One way I remember, I think it might have been during my undergraduate studies, Intro to Hebrew Bible, the professor in question said, in the Hebrew biblical thought, commenting on this passage, humans don't have a soul, they are a soul. I don't know.
That's what I would say, right? I mean, definitely it would be that individual human is a nephesh, is a living being, not that they have a soul, have a nephesh in that sense. Now, what's interesting in classical rabbinic texts, the similar concept of the human being as that living combination of, say, body and spirit, or body and soul, comes in, that the rabbinic texts do actually use a term for body of guf, which isn't found in the biblical context. So the rabbinic texts in some ways talk about the human being as a combination of body and soul, but still the human being is that living combination, and so isn't identified with the soul separately from the body. So in many ways, then the classical rabbinic texts carry over that embodied living conception of the human being that we find in the biblical texts.
Okay.
So again, with the starting point of this midrashic interpretation that begins with, as you said, verse from the book of Proverbs about the pious person does good to his own nephesh, to his own soul or self. That also seems to be starting with the notion of an embodied notion of nephesh.
Right. It's not just taking care of my soul in some kind of spiritual sense, or the rational part of myself, or I don't know, even that immortal part of myself that might live on beyond. It's the whole self here, it seems.
Right. And the way that, I mean, that's brought out very clearly, because after quoting this verse, it goes on to give a narrative about Hillel, Hillel the Elder, who would have a conversation with his students, and it turns out that he's seems to be interpreting this verse as referring to taking care of one's nephesh means to wash in the bathhouse. And he says, I'm going to go do a commandment. And his students say, oh, what commandment is that? He says, oh, I'm going to go wash in the bathhouse. And they seem surprised by that. But he wants to then attribute, there's a religious value to taking care of one's embodied self.
Yes, yeah, then we can actually look at that passage a little more carefully. So in your article, you discuss this passage from Leviticus Rabbah. It starts with a biblical quote from Proverbs about that it's good for a pious person to take care of their soul. And then there's Hillel the Elder, one of the most celebrated rabbinic sages in the Talmud, or at least in Jewish memory. Here in where I'm at, there's a Hillel Center, for example. And Hillel's going to the bathhouse. What I found very striking about this passage, or interesting, is that the bathhouse is a Greco-Roman institution par excellence, right? And this rabbi is going to bathe there, and he's saying, I'm completing a mitzvah. I'm going there to fulfill a commandment. The students of Hillel are like, which commandment are you fulfilling? Yeah. How does he justify or explain that he's fulfilling a commandment here by going to the bathhouse?
Right. So he, when the students question why would washing in the bathhouse be a religious commandment, commandment from God? he gives an analogy or a parable. So I'll read out what he says to them. He says, yes, it's a commandment because if it's the case that for icons or images of kings or emperors, that they, and here referring to the Romans, that they place in their theaters and their circuses, in that context, there's a person who's appointed over them, who polishes the images of the king and who washes them, and they even pay him a salary for doing so. And not only that, but they exalt him among the great ones of the realm. Then Hillel says, how much the more so in the case of me, for I was created in the image and likeness of God, as is written, citing Genesis 9:6, for in the image of God, he made the human being. So we have Hillel basically says that the human being is the image of God, and he compares that then to the images of the Roman emperor, who so in a Roman imperial context, there would often be carvings, either flat images or three-dimensional images of the Roman Empire, which would be placed in prominent public places, and there would be a person appointed to make sure those images are kept clean, because the way that the image of the emperor is displayed reflects on the glory and respect due to the emperor. And so he says the human being is created as the image of God. And so it's also an important duty to take care and make sure to keep the image of God clean by washing in the bathhouse. And so what's interesting here is then this is in line with a classical rabbinic understanding that the human being as the image of God refers to the visible material embodied aspect of the human being, that living element of the body and soul together. And so in that case, to wash one's physical body is to take care of the image of God in that sense. So image of God doesn't just refer to some invisible feature of the human being, but incorporates the whole corporeal body of the human being as well.
And so this passage nicely introduces the point that you're trying to make in this article about the classical rabbinic literature having a iconic perspective. In fact, in the passage from Leviticus Rabbah, they use a loan word. There are a lot of loan words in classical rabbinic literature from Greek and from here. They're actually using a loan word, iqon, from the Greek icon, which gives us icon English, in the Hebrew text of Leviticus Rabbah, correct?
Yeah, exactly. So when in the part where Hillel is talking about making the comparison, he's talking about the images or icons of the emperor that you see in public around. He uses the term iqonin, so from the Greek word icon. And this is actually occurs repeatedly in rabbinic literature, that describing this notion of images using this Greek term icon. Again, that ends up becoming the English word icon as well, the Greek derived term. So this Hebrew text in the middle of what's mostly a Hebrew sentence puts in this Greek loan word, and then uses that in describing the human being status. Every human being, every individual human being, is the image of God. The Hebrew term is a tselem, but then these rabbinic texts also use the Greek word, so icon. So essentially saying that the human being is the icon of God. So we can, it's and explicitly drawing upon the discourse of Roman, in this case pagan icons of the emperor, but using this, there was an existing iconic conceptuality that was used in this Roman imperial context for images of the emperor, and so the rabbinic texts then are drawing on that iconic way of thinking, that the image represents the emperor, and the respect that one pays to the image of the emperor is actually carrying over to having respect for the emperor himself. So likewise, if you're keeping the human beings, one's own body clean, as oneself as the icon of God, you are then displaying honor and honoring upkeep, visible upkeep of the icon of God as the human body, living human body.
That's fascinating. I mean, literally, it's an iconic understanding
Right.
of the matter. And in some of the other rabbinic passages that you discuss, this Greek loan word appears again. I'm thinking of the next one of the next passages in your article, which is drawn from Midrash Tehillim, so a commentary in the book of Psalms. That's a rather late rabbinic work, correct? But it might contain earlier materials.
Yes, correct. I mean, it's the question of the dating of some of these collections is notoriously difficult. I mean, I think it's with Midrash Tehillim, Midrash on Psalms, this collection, the first reference to, I think, is found in the 11th century. So it was compiled sometime before that, could be, who knows, maybe the 9th century. But some of the material in the collection may date back earlier. And actually, this particular passage, which we're about to discuss from Midrash Tehillim, is also found in other Midrash collections. It's found in Deuteronomy Rabbah, Midrash Tanchuma. So those are on the late-ish side, but probably then would indicate that this particular interpretation would go back at least, say, to around the time of the Babylonian Talmud.
I mean, when you're looking at
classical
passage,
period,
it's set in a Greco-Roman context. I mean, that doesn't prove it's from that period, but it assumes that context nonetheless, right? It's a brief text. I'll just read it out loud, and then you can comment, share a few words about it. It states, quote, "When a person walks on the highway, a procession," and in the Hebrew, it's iqonia, iqonia or iqonia. I don't have the Hebrew text in front of me. I see it transliterated, but that's clearly a loan word of angels goes before him, proclaiming, "Make way for the icon or image," again, the same loan word, "of the Holy One, blessed be he," end quote. So how is this passage informed by imperial practices, and how does it serve to elevate the rabbinic notion of kavod habriot, which you mentioned in your article, and you also might want to explain to our viewers?
Right. Yeah. So again, just so this in this rabbinic passage, it describes it saying when a person walks on the highway. So that might seem like a normal event, an everyday event, but this rabbinic passage wants to say, no, actually, every time a person is walking down the highway, it's a special celestial event because each person's the image of God. And so it says that a procession of angels, an iqonia, again, the same icon-related word, a procession of angels goes before him, and this procession proclaims, "Make way for the icon of the Holy One, blessed be he." And this scholars have linked this phrasing to imperial practices where the notion of a procession, an imperial procession, where images of the emperor were ceremonially paraded. And there would be imperial messengers leading the procession and announcing the image's arrival to onlookers. So it could be that the Roman emperor is not able to be in multiple places at once, but there could be a sending of special images of the emperor to different places, so to a given locale, and it could be carried in a procession. And there could be messengers who go before it proclaiming that the image of the emperor is about to arrive. And these imperial images then had much of the weight and dignity of the emperor himself arriving in the town. And so that there was a great respect accorded to these images of the emperor, almost as standing in for the emperor himself. And so in this context, it seems to be mapping this onto saying that, therefore, in that same way, when a human being walks down the highway, it asserts that there's a procession of angels going before the human being, proclaiming, "Here comes the icon, the image of God," and that just as God is even greater than the emperor, so even more respect should be given to this everyday human being, even then that's given to the image of the Roman emperor. So really elevating the status of each everyday human being, that every human being is the image of God in that context. And as you said, it ties in with this rabbinic notion of kavod habriot. So that literally translates as the respect or honor or glory due to the created beings. But what it means is kavod habriot is this respect, honor, glory due to every human being. And so it ties in with the image of God. And here this notion of honor or respect or glory comes across in relation to the way, in which you should give just as much reverence to the image of the emperor as you would to the emperor himself. And so the message is you should give just as much respect to every human being, even the seemingly most mundane or lowly human being, as give that respect as though this is the image, because this is the image of God. And so just as you would give great respect if God came into town, also then you should give this great respect to each human being as the visible image of God.
Right. This notion of kavod habriot is a very key concept in rabbinic literature and plays out in concrete ways. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, with burial, there's a commandment to bury human beings, and it's showing dignity to the human.
Right.
You can't leave a corpse exposed. You need to bury it as soon as possible. I'm just maybe citing that as example because I was very intrigued by, and maybe most intrigued by, one of the passages you discuss in your article from the Tosefta. That's actually one of the texts we didn't say, but it's from the classical period. Sometimes with my students who are familiar with the Gospels, I say, well, think of the Synoptic Gospels. You have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're kind of similar. The Tosefta is sort of the Synoptic counterpart of the Mishnah. Know how you describe it, but 3rd century CE, give or take, is that
right? Yeah, so basically around the same basic time as the Mishnah, and having similar shape and subject matter. So yeah, I think your description sounds good.
All right, so I mean, I was really fascinated by this text. So it's from the Tosefta, tractate Sanhedrin. So the Mishnah or the Tosefta are divided into tractates. So there's a tractate called Sanhedrin 9:7, which presents a striking interpretation of Deuteronomy 21, verse 23, which reads, quote, a hung person, so somebody who's hanging, is a curse of God, end quote. As I was reading this text, since I'm primarily trained as a New Testament scholar, I inevitably wandered off to Paul in Galatians, who does discuss this very same phrase. But before we entertain any speculation about if there's a connection or a reaction here from the Rabbinic literature to the Christian literature, it might be worthwhile to just read briefly aloud here for our audience the entire Toseftan passage, which we're going to also provide a link in Sefaria so you can see the text for yourself. But the text reads as follows. Rabbi Meir said, what does scripture mean when it says, quote, for a hung person, in Hebrew, hung person is talui is a curse of God, end quote, Deuteronomy 21, verse 23. A parable. It is like a case of two twin brothers who were alike in appearance. One was king over the whole world, and the other took to banditry. After some time, the one who took to banditry was arrested, and they crucified him on the cross. In the Hebrew, v'hayu solvim oto al ha'tzaluf. Everyone who passed by would say, it seems like the king has been crucified. Therefore, is said in the verse from Deuteronomy, for a hung person is a curse of God. So what's the main point of this passage, and how does it agree with the iconic theology that you discern in other classical rabbinic texts? You also suggest that this passage may share affinities with the rabbinic tendency of making capital punishment extremely difficult. So perhaps you could also explain to our viewers what you mean by that.
Sure. So a number of things. So first of all, as we said, it begins as it's framed as an interpretation of the scriptural verse, for a hung person is a curse of God. And this verse can be interpreted in various ways. And as you said, so the instance of Paul in Galatians is one form, but one of the questions with the verse is a potential ambiguity of what does it mean to say a hung person is a curse of God. So one possibility could mean to say, if somebody is hung, that means they've been cursed by God. That would be one way of reading the Hebrew. But one other way of reading it, and this is the way that this rabbinic text goes, is that a hung person is a curse of God that when a human being is hung, that act of hanging or displaying a hung person is actually to curse God. That there's something that insults God about hanging a person. And so this ties into the notion that actually one should treat human beings with respect, and the aspect of displaying a dead human being hung up, either hung by a noose or hung on a cross, is considered by the rabbinic text to be an insult to God. So whoever would do that would be insulting God. So a hung person is a curse of God, can be read as that the hanged human being is related to something insulting or cursing of God. And they illustrate that, as we said, through a parable, where it talks about two twin brothers who are alike in appearance. And already the aspect when it says they were alike in appearance, I think points us to this aspect of the human being as the visible image of God. It's the human being as the image of God and the human being's visible appearance. And it gives a story about the two twin brothers, one who was king of the whole world, and another who took to banditry. And oftentimes in rabbinic parables, the king, if there's a king in the parable, that often refers to God. So here it seems to be the two brothers who are like in appearance. One is the bandit, and one is the king of the whole world. Seems to be alluding to then the two brothers are the twins, are the human being and God, and somehow that the human being, when you would look at the human being, just as when you look at one brother, it would call to mind the other brother. So too, in this case, it's saying when you look at a human being, it should call to mind God. And therefore, if a human being is hung, even if they're a criminal, it's still as though saying somehow if you hang or crucify the human being, that's it would call to mind as though God is being hung or crucified. And so this is, again, in keeping with rabbinic text. There's another related text that talks about when a human being is executed, God feels pain. It says God says things that, for instance, such as things like saying, my arm is hurting or heavy, or my head is hurting or heavy. So God feels suffering when the human being feels physical suffering. So this correlates with this idea of, therefore you should refrain from causing suffering or dishonor or indignity to a human being who's the image of God, because that then reflects in some ways causes harm to God.
I mean, which is such a fascinating spin, because if you just read this passage from Deuteronomy 23 in its original context, it doesn't seem to be going in that the direction. But here are the rabbis. It works grammatically speaking in Hebrew. You can take this construct state and curse of God. It concerns God and elevates, therefore, the human position here in this very iconic way, as you're trying to say, because the human is being compared to God in a visual, even maybe corporeal manner, which is very fascinating. Just with the point with the capital punishment. So what are the implications here or the connection with capital punishment in the classical rabbinic understanding?
Right. So it raises the question, if to carry out capital punishment in this sense would be somehow to insult or harm God, then it would be a question of, it would seem one would not want to do that, since one does not want to cause that insult to God. But so on the one hand, the rabbinic texts are working with that impulse. On the other hand, they're working with the biblical text, which has various instances where it says, if a person does such and such, they shall be put to death. So it seems that there would be a biblical imperative or commandments to execute people, certain human beings. On the other hand, it's saying if you execute a human being, you're insulting God, and so or even harming God. So how do they balance this? If you look at then what the rabbinic texts do with these forms of capital punishment, they leave them on the books, you could say, but at the same time they make it very difficult to actually convict someone of a capital crime. So for instance, there are various discussions where it says that to execute someone for a capital crime, before they carry out the act, the person needs to have been warned by two witnesses not to do that. The witnesses say, don't you know that this would be a capital crime if you carry it out? So if the criminal hadn't been warned just before doing the act, then you can't convict them. And there are passages where it even says not only do the two witnesses have to warn the would-be criminal beforehand, but the person has to then say, yes, I realize that this is a capital crime and I'm doing it anyway. And if they haven't verbally taken ownership of it in that way, then you can't convict them. So this is the thing various scholars have noted, this tendency in these rabbinic texts, leaving the capital crimes on the books, but making it very difficult to actually convict or carry out.
Right. Yeah. In fact, in the same tractate, Sanhedrin, is where they discuss a lot of the matters. I don't know if I suffer from parallelomania. It's a term you'd probably know well. Samuel Sandmel, a late professor of New Testament and early Judaism, coined this term. But when you read this passage the first time, did you think about the Christian texts, the bandit, the king being crucified on the cross, and the king as an allegory for God? Made me think, for example, of the Gospel of Luke. And I spent a lot of time reading the Gospel of Luke, Jesus being crucified between two bandits. It was hard for my mind not to think about this. I know it's a very complicated issue, the relationship with rabbinics and the New Testament, as well as early Christian literature. But what's just your reaction?
No, yeah, I agree. It does seem there seems to be some striking parallels. I mean, both the Gospel of Luke, but also in the Gospel of Matthew talks about the two bandits being crucified, and actually even has the parallel, talks about people passing by, commenting on it. And likewise, this Tosefta passage talks about those who passed by commented, says it seems that the king is being hanged. Yeah, again, exactly what the relation is not fully clear, but the parallels do seem close. And right, so basically, whether this is drawing on elements in the Gospels or even maybe 3rd century Christian theology, is it might the rabbinic texts have been familiar through verbal conversation with some elements of Christian theology at that time period? But right, it does seem to be described a parable where it's the person on the cross is actually seems to be God or the king. You have a parable where the person on the cross looks like the king, and if the king is God, then it's this theme of God on the cross. So what's notable about it is actually, so if you compared it to some elements of Christian theology, it might be that the rabbinic texts aren't objecting to the idea of God on the cross, that the person being crucified would in some ways correspond to God. But what it does differently, saying, oh, that might be the case, but it's not just Jesus who would be God on the cross, but any human being, since all human beings are the image of God, any human being who's hung or crucified is then somehow God on the cross. So rather than negating the Christian theology in that regard, it might be seen as expanding it to all human beings. So so the dynamics are interesting there.
That thought crossed my mind, especially based on what you discuss later, which we're going to get to in a moment here. So we might come back to that point. But so just moving on, the next section of your article transitions to Maimonides and his understanding of what it means for humans to be created in the image of God. For our viewers, again, who might not be familiar with Maimonides, could you just say a few words about who Maimonides was, and then how his understanding about the human being in the image of God contrasts with the preceding classical rabbinic perspectives?
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah. So if we talked before about there's the classical rabbinic period, and then we could say the medieval rabbinic period. In this article, I've been focusing on the classical rabbinic texts, whereas then Maimonides would fall in the medieval rabbinic period. And so we can ask about differences between the classical rabbinic texts and some of these medieval Jewish texts. And there's, again, a variety of different orientations even within the medieval period. But Maimonides himself lived primarily in the 12th century, so from 1138 to 1204. And he was a very prominent and well-known figure in his own time as a leader of especially the Jewish community in Egypt. And he was well known both as a legal scholar and as a philosopher. And so was also shaped by reading various texts, especially coming through the Arabic philosophical tradition and texts that were then drawn from the Greek philosophical tradition. So especially texts by Aristotle and Plato were influential on Maimonides. So one thing that's notable about Maimonides is that seems to be in contrast to the classical rabbinic conception of the image of God. As I said, in the classical rabbinic conception, the image of God is the embodied human being, and that visible, material, living, embodied status as the image of God. And what that seems to mean in the classical rabbinic text is that every single human being is equally the image of God, because every human being has a body, in that sense. Whereas for Maimonides, the image of God is specifically the rational intellect, or the rational soul, you could say. And for Maimonides, it's then specifically it's the notion of image of God is not connected to visible appearance or bodily form. And because for him, it's connected to rational intellect, because not everybody has developed their rational intellect to the same degree. Therefore, not everybody is equally the image of God. And so he might say that philosophers like himself are more the image of God than uneducated people, whereas the classical rabbinic texts don't seem to have that same elite division, that they would say everybody is the image of God, regardless of your intellect.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I was just thinking of the 13 principles, right, that are usually attributed to Maimonides, and one that says, Ein lo guf, ein lo demut guf, he has no body, God, and has no resemblance of a body. That's very
right. So this
Maimonidean, right?
Exactly. So this incorporeal notion of God in Maimonides then also corresponds to an incorporeal notion of the image of God. And so in that way, for Maimonides, if it's the image of God means something incorporeal, and specifically the rational intellect, and then which is then developed to different degrees in different people, he says would take the stance we saw before about how the classical rabbinic texts say even the hanged criminal is the image of God. Whereas for Maimonides, there's more of a tendency to say, well, somebody who would be violating God's laws has clearly then not developed their rational intellect properly if they would be acting in this irrational way to violate these laws. Therefore, the criminal has shown themselves not to be the image of God because they have not enacted their rational intellect. And therefore, if you're executing the criminal, you're not actually then causing harm to the image of God in the same way, because the criminal doesn't enact the image of God. So there's less of a problem with executing someone. Whereas for the classical text, because the image of God is linked to just also the living, physically embodied human being, then even the criminal is also, to execute the criminal is still violating the image of God, because you're causing death and harm to the physical living body.
So my understanding is that Maimonides nevertheless was against capital punishment because there was always the risk of executing an innocent person.
Okay, right. Well, actually, the question of Maimonides' overall stance to capital punishment is more complicated because he inherits many of these previous rabbinic legal restrictions on that make it difficult to actually convict a person. So in various you could say the legal context, he could still have restrictions on carrying out capital punishment. So the point that I'm trying to emphasize, though, is that in the theological or conceptual account of the image of God, the idea of that the criminal as the image of God wouldn't be so much of a stumbling block. There might be laws against executing someone, as you said, potentially for you don't want to execute an innocent person, but the rabbinic text would say it's a problem to execute a criminal. It creates a difficulty because even the criminal is the image of God on that theological conceptual sense. And Maimonides seems to have a different theological conceptual understanding of the image of God, and doesn't seem to have that same iconic notion where the visible embodied human being is the image of God, and therefore it would create this different dynamic towards criminals, even though with some overlap in other ways with the classical rabbinic ideas.
And I believe you note that in your article, so Maimonides' perspective on the image of God, the human likeness to God, becomes a more dominant view in the Jewish tradition, and this corporeal, iconic understanding that we see in the earlier classical rabbinic literature sort of recedes a bit to the background, maybe, if I put it that way. Would you agree with that?
Well, it depends. I think with in sort of in that time period of Maimonides, we see coming into this Jewish rabbinic tradition an idea of the image of God that's not iconic, not corporeal. That's more linked. The image of God is something invisible, an invisible aspect of each human being. So that does come into the tradition, but at the same time, there are ways in which the more embodied, iconic notion of the human being as image of God is still retained. Okay. In different streams of tradition. So not Maimonides himself, but so after Maimonides, you have both of those perhaps contradictory or competing notions of image of God within the tradition. So sometimes some thinkers might emphasize one more than the other. But it does differ from the classical rabbinic texts, which in general seem consistently to have the iconic or embodied notion of image of God.
Okay, well, moving on here, your article doesn't just cover rabbinic literature, but also the writings of a certain John of Damascus. For our viewers, who was John of Damascus, and how does he justify the use of icons in Christian worship?
Okay, yeah, so John of Damascus was a significant writer in, especially within what became the Orthodox Christianity or Eastern Orthodox tradition. So he's John of Damascus. He's from Damascus, so in present-day Syria, and he lived from around 675 to 749. So actually, sort of around the end, paralleling the end part of the classical rabbinic period. Although he wasn't in that in that framework himself. So he's writing in the Christian tradition, writing in Greek. But if he's writing then, say, in the 8th century, this was in a context where various Christian individuals and groups, some Christians had raised the idea that it was inappropriate to use icons in worship. And so this is icons in the sense of humanly made, visible, say, paintings that representing sometimes saints, but also most prominently icons of Christ in Christian tradition, and using these in various forms of religious worship and veneration. And so there were some Christian writers who said that icons should not be used in Christian context because icons are material objects. God is non-material and invisible, and therefore reverence should not be given to these visible material objects. Whereas John of Damascus was then part of the tendency that opposed that iconoclastic opposition to icons and wrote in defense of icons, saying why icons were actually a legitimate and valuable part of Christian religious practice. And so some of his arguments that he gave drew upon certain types of what you could call iconic theology. And so he said that he argued that within widely held Christian theology of his time, it was held that God had become visible in the incarnation in Christ. And so therefore, if God can become visible and material in Christ, so too the material and visible status of icons is not inherently in contradiction to how God operates. And so therefore they can have a legitimate place. He also actually drew upon parallels to the way images of the Roman emperor were used.
Interesting.
And actually this is where, again, some of the parallels with the rabbinic texts come in, which, as we saw, they also drew upon ways in which the images of the Roman emperor were used. So John of Damascus, for instance, gives an argument that we see from the way images of the emperor are treated, that by showing honor and respect to the image of the emperor is a way of also showing respect to the emperor himself. And so he argued likewise, then showing respect to an icon of Christ is a way of showing respect to Christ. So that the icon then points you to the that which it's visibly making present. So these were some of his arguments in favor of icons. And part of what I argue is that actually, though, even though the rabbinic texts don't permit the use of painted icons in religious worship, they do seem to work within iconic theology, where the living embodied human being is an icon of God, and God can then be made present visibly and materially through the embodied human being as the image of God. So that some of the way of thinking, the iconic way of thinking, does seem very similar between these classical rabbinic texts and then the iconic argumentation that we see in John of Damascus.
That's right. Yeah, this is and maybe the last question is the overlap or potential intersection between the mutual iconic understandings. Icon being a very key word and concept in the Orthodox Christian tradition, the veneration of icons. And so we have these two traditions that do, if we're talking about the classical rabbinic tradition, an iconic understanding of of theology. That said, you did also highlight some differences, and I'm thinking back to the earlier passage in Tosefta as well now, where I mean, you kindly put it as the Tosefta passage may be expanding the idea that all human beings are in the likeness of God. But in Christian theology, there is this idea that Christ is, in some sense, uniquely, right, the image of God. So maybe just here at the end, you could contrast a bit the perspectives as well.
Right, it's an interesting question, because I would say, right, the rabbinic approach seems to be that they do seem to uphold the notion of the unique image of God, but they say each individual is a unique image of God. So every individual is different from one another, yet each of them is a unique image of God. But right, so it's not just Jesus that would be the image of God. They do seem to say that every individual person in their distinct individuality is the image of God. And that part, again, this notion of every human being as the image of God also draws a lot on Genesis, both in Genesis 1 and Genesis 9, describing all human beings as the image of God. So the later Christian tradition has the notion of there's some streams of emphasis that talk about Jesus as the unique image of God, but that same Christian tradition also does still retain this notion, biblical notion, especially from Genesis, of every human being as the image of God. So the rabbinic text might place a stronger emphasis on the every human being as the embodied image of God that makes God present in that way. But it's not, so it does have a different emphasis than this Christian stream of theology. So it's different in that way, but there's still these conceptual connections.
You also notice, I think, that the rabbinic understanding doesn't extend this logic of, well, we can now also make images of God as representation of humans as representations of God, you know, statues or paintings. It's only, I guess, God's creations of humans that are representations of the divine.
Right, so it's the living human being that's the icon of God, rather than a humanly made painting or statue. So they don't identify these humanly made paintings or statues as icons of God, but just the living human being. On the other hand, that does mean they actually place an emphasis on procreation as a commandment, so that actually human beings can be actively involved in helping to create new images of God through having children. So it's not taken out of human hands entirely, but it is only the living human being that they say can be the icon of God. It's also very interesting that one other difference that could be explored more is the idea that in some of these Christian streams of theology, there's a notion that Jesus is the visible making present of the God the Father, who's invisible. And the interesting, it seems to be that in the rabbinic text, they're not talking about God the Son and God the Father. They just talk in terms of the Holy One, blessed be He. And they refer to God as, our Father in heaven. But so in that sense, though, they don't seem to treat God as inherently invisible. In the sense that, so when the human being is the visible image of God, it's not because God's self is inherently invisible. There are various rabbinic passages where they talk about God revealing God's self visibly. For instance, when the Israelites are saved from the Egyptians at the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds, the moment, the scene at the sea is described in rabbinic text. God made God's self visible to all the Israelites at that moment. So it's not that God is never visible, but is seldom visible. God can freely reveal God's self. So human beings are normally not in a position to see God and should not make visible humanly constructed images of God to try to see God if God isn't revealing God's self, but they don't seem to treat God as inherently invisible. And so that could go along with why they can partially have an iconic understanding of the human being as a visible image of God. It can still be the human being in their embodied visible form that can constitute the image of God. So this question of God's visibility or invisibility and the human being as the visible or invisible image of God might be a difference for comparison in the with some of these rabbinic and Christian traditions.
On certain special occasions, right? Humans get to see God in the rabbinic tradition, for example, at the splitting of the sea, or which would contrast somewhat with the Gospel of John, where Jesus says, "Nobody can see the Father except through me." Right? There's no direct access to seeing the Father in some of these Christian traditions.
Right, because this question of God's invisibility, right, seems to be saying the Gospel of John, that idea is there. But scholars have looked at, for instance, so in the Hebrew Bible, there don't seem to be places where it seems to be actively working with the notion that God is inherently invisible. There are prohibitions on seeing God or on trying to see God, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be working with the notion of God as by nature invisible. And likewise, so in the classical rabbinic text, and possibly also in some of the texts that are now in the New Testament. So the Gospel of John might go into more God is invisible, but it might be the Synoptic Gospels could be potentially working with notions more similar to the Hebrew Bible or classical rabbinic literature in that regard. So this is a topic that is an interesting one to look at between rabbinic and Christian traditions. And as we said, by the time you get to the Middle Ages, someone like Maimonides affirms that God is invisible. So it's not just Jewish versus Christian. It depends on which Jewish and which Christian text you're looking at.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, for your time and generosity. It's been a fascinating discussion. Before we go here, what are you currently working on? Any interesting projects that are in progress right now?
Yeah, so a couple of them I'm working on. One is on actually looking at early rabbinic literature. So it's known as Tannaitic literature. So these rabbinic texts from the 3rd century. And reassessing what their attitudes are towards various ideas that have been associated with early Christianity or the Jesus movement. And it's been interesting finding ways in which some of the things that people might have assumed that these early rabbinic texts would have a negative attitude towards, it seems that actually when you look at them on their own and don't blur them together with later rabbinic texts, it might be the early rabbinic texts don't seem to have negative attitudes to many of the things that people had previously assumed. So that's one project. Another one is looking at aspects of midrash, of classical rabbinic scriptural interpretation, and how that relates to experimental linguistics studies done today on general human language processing, and whether there might be, even though some of the midrashic interpretations, some people might think they look strange or unusual, there might be some underlying connections with broader patterns of human language interpretation that psychologists and experimental scientists have uncovered in recent decades.
Wow, wow. Those are really very interesting topics. You've shared already with me some of your ideas about the first project, and maybe we can have you again in the future for this topic, for this interview here with two scholars and a Talmud. Thank you again. We're going to provide a link at the bottom to the volume in which Daniel Weiss's article appears, so that our viewers can hopefully access and purchase that, and links as well to some of the texts we've discussed. Thank you again, Daniel Weiss. Be well and stay well.
Yeah, thank you.